When she reached the waterfall, she went to the gap and gingerly touched the rock surface. It was the same plastic as the cobblestones. Like the path, it was hard plastic, solid. But because it looks like rocks, it felt insustainable when she touched it. Charlie took her hands away and wiped them on her jeans. She stepped carefully sideways, scooting through the hole behind the waterfall. The cavern was only a few feet long, but she stopped for a moment at the center. She felt trapped in the darkness, though she could see the light on either side. Trapped. Her chest tightened and she screwed her eyes shut. Calm down. Focus on what's around you, she thought. Charlie took a long, steady breath and listened. Standing beneath the waterfall, the tape recording was muffled. She thought she could hear the water itself, rushing through her head and splaying down in front of her. Though she couldn't see it, there was something else as well, quiet but distant. From above her, or maybe behind, Charlie could hear the cranking of gears. A machine was churning the water, keeping it flowing in a giant cycle, making the whole thing work. The sound of the machine at work calmed her. The rising panic subsided, and she opened her eyes. She took another sideways step, moving closer to the light, and stubbed her toe on something hard. A shock of pain jolted her. The object tipped over, making a sloshing sound as it fell. Grinding her teeth, she waited a few moments for her toe to stop hurting, then maneuvered herself into a crouch. It was a fuel can for the waterfall. She realized as the machinery ground on the overhead, there were several more, all neatly arranged along the wall, but this time had been in the middle of the path. If she had been going faster, she would have fallen over it. Excuse me. Excuse me. Charlie sat firmly beside the others and stepped quickly into the other half of the room. Hello, the voice again. This time a little louder. Charlie stood up straight, immediately on alert. It had come from ahead. She didn't respond this time, but moved carefully toward it, staying on the path and keeping close to the wall. The hallway opened out to another room. The lights were dimmer here. In the corner opposite, Charlie was a small carousel, but there seemed to be little else. Charlie scanned the room and then her breath caught. The child was there, motionless, almost hidden in the shadows in the far corner of the room. Charlie approached slowly, apprehensive of what she might find. She blinked and shook her head hard. Her dizziness was surging. The room seemed to spin around her. Who are you? Are you alright? She wanted to ask but kept silent. She stepped closer and the figure came into focus. It was just another animatronic, or perhaps just a normal doll, made to look like a little boy selling balloons. He was perhaps 4 feet tall, with a round head and a round body, his arms almost as long as his stout legs. He wore a red and blue striped shirt with a matching propeller. Beanie on his head, he was made of plastic, but his shiny face had something old fashioned about it. Its features mimicked fairy tale dolls carved from wood. His nose was a triangle and his cheeks were made of rosy with two raised circles of dusky pink. His blue eyes were enormous, wide, and staring, and his mouth was open in a grin that bared all his even white teeth. His hands were fingerless balls which gripped an object. On one, on one, he held a red and yellow balloon, nearly half the size of a stick. On the other, he raised a wooden sign read balloons. He was nothing like the creatures Charlie's father had made. Nothing even like the animatronics had been that kidnapped her. They were horrible, but she recognized them as twisted copies of her father's work. This boy was something new. She circled around him, tempted to poke and prod, but she held back. Don't chance triggering anything. You're not so bad, Charlie murmured, cautious not to make her eyes off of him. He just kept grinning, wide-eyed into the darkness. Turning her attention to the rest of the room, Charlie looked thoughtfully in the carousel. The only thing were besides the boy. She was too far away to make out the animals. "Hello," said the voice right behind her. She just wound back just in time to see the boy turn toward her with a single swinging step. Charlie screamed and ran back the way she came from, but beneath her feet the dirt began to stir. It jolted as if something were bumping upward. She scrambled backward as the dirt rose again. Something broke through the surface. Charlie ran for the carousel, the only cover in the room. She ducked behind it, laying down on her stomach so her body would be hidden behind its base. She stared down at the ground and listened to muffled scratches and beating sounds as some creature climbed free of its grave. The spinning sensation of took hold of her again. The black and white tiles swam beneath her. She tried to push herself up to peek over the carousel, but her head felt leaded. The weight of it held her down, threatening to pin her down to the ground. There's something wrong with this room. Shelley gritted her teeth and yanked her up. She scrambled to her feet, steadied herself against the carousel, and ran back the way she came, not looking back. The room with the games and the harsh black light was dizzying as well, as it sprawled out in all directions. Everything seemed farther apart from before. The walls, miles away. Her mind was numb. She fumbled to remember where she was, unable to see which way was which. She stumbled forward, and another mound of earth rose ahead of her. Something glimmered. Her eyes lit in the silhouettes of arcade games. Her reflective surfaces acted as beacons in the dark. She staggered toward them, her head swaying, so heavy she could hardly stay upright. The walls were crawling with activity, small things skittering disjointedly all over the ceiling. But she couldn't see what they were. They were wriggling under the paint. Their surface undulated chaotically. There was a strange ringing in the air.
Can you teach me how to make popcorn?
After this chapter, okay? So no. Sorry about that.
There's no one in your game.
There was a strange ringing in the air, and though she could only now register it, she realized it had been something all along. She stopped in her tracks and looked desperately for the source, but her vision was cloudy and her thoughts were slow. She could barely name the thoughts she saw. Rectangle, she thought fuzzily. Circle, no, sphere. She looked from the indistinct shape to another, trying to remember what they were called. The effort distracted her from staying on her feet, and she fell to the ground again with a hard thud. Charlie was sitting upright, but her head dragged at her, threatening to pull her over. "Hello?" A voice called again. She put her hands on her head, forcing it back, and looked up to see silver children standing around her, all with plump little bodies and broad smiling faces. "Sammy?" She moved toward them indistinctly. They were blurred, and she couldn't see their features. She blinked, but her vision didn't clear. "Don't trust your senses. Something is wrong." "Stay back!" Charlie screamed at them. She forced herself unsteadily to her feet and stumbled toward the shadows cast by the arcade towers. There, at last, she might be hidden from whatever worse things lurked in the room. The children went with her, rushing in trails of color around her and sweeping in and out of view. They seemed more to float than walk. Charlie kept her eyes on the towers. The children were distracting, but she knew there was something worse nearby. She could hear the sickening grind of metal and plastic twisting, a rasping noise she recognized. Sharp feet scraping against the floor, digging graves into the tile. She crouched low, fixing her eyes on the nearest open door, and was struck with a certainty that this was the way she had come. She crawled desperately toward it, moving as fast as she could without fully standing. Finally, she collapsed under her own weight and lay flat on the tile again. "You have to get up, now!" Chelia screamed and clambered to her feet. She ran headlong into the next room, barely keeping her balance, and skidded to a stop. The room was full of dining tables and carnival games. It was where she started, but something had changed. All the eyes were tracking her. The creatures were moving, their skins stretching organically, their mouths snapping. Shirley ran for the dining table in the corner of the room, the largest one with a tablecloth that almost reached the floor on all sides. She slid to the ground and crawled under it, curling herself into a ball and pulling her legs tight against her for a moment. There was only silence, and then the voices began again. "Hello?" A voice called from somewhere nearby. The tablecloth rustled. Shirley held her breath. She looked at the thin gap between the tablecloth and the floor, but she could only see a silver of black and white tile. Something shot by, too fast to see, and she gasped and drew back, forgetting to be silent. The cloth rustled again, swinging gently inward. Something inside was parting it. Charlie maneuvered herself onto her hands and knees, feeling as she had too many arms and legs. The cloth moved again. This time, a swirl of color appeared and vanished in the gap. The children. They had found her. The tablecloth swung again, but now it was moving on all sides, bouncing up and down as the children brushed against it. The strange, colorful trails of movement brushed against it. The strange, colorful trails of movement appeared and vanished all around the edges of her hiding place, surrounding her like a wall of living paper dolls. "Hello? Hello? Hello?" More than one spoke at a time now, but not in a chorus. Their voices overlapped until the word became a meaningless layer of sound, blurred like the fleeing children themselves. She turned her face to the side. One of the children stared back. It was under the cloth and gazing at her with a fixed grin and motionless eyes. Charlie jumped, banging her head on the tabletop. She looked around wildly. She was surrounded, a smiling, blurring face was staring at her from every side. One, two, three, four, four, four. She turned at an awkward circle in her hands and knees. Two of the children fainted at her, making little jumps as they were about to spring. They turned again. The next one leaped at her, swimming under the tablecloth in a bright streak of blue and yellow. Shelley froze. "What do I do?" She scrambled in her sluggish brain, trying desperately to receive it. Another swept of color rushed all at her, all purple, and her brain woke. "Run!" Charlie scrambled to the tablecloth in her hands and knees and grabbed it, yanking off the table as she stood. She threw it down behind her and ran, not looking back as someone called again. "Hello?" She raced toward a sign propped up in the middle of the room, knocking it over behind her as she ran past. Then a shadow near the stage caught her attention, and she swerved. She tripped over a chair and just barely managed to catch herself on another table. Her head was still so heavy. It jerked her forward, and she shoved the table aside, managing to stay upright. She arrived at the stage, and in the shadow there was a door. Charlie fumbled with the knob, but it was spongy, too soft to turn. She grabbed it with both hands, putting the whole force of her body behind it. It moved at last. The door opened. She hurried through and slammed it behind shut, feeling for some kind of latch. She found one and snapped it shut. As she did, her hand brushed a light switch. A bulb flickering for a moment, then came on dimly, a single glowing strand of orange illuminating the room. Charlie stared at it for a moment, waiting for the rest of the light. No more appeared. She leaned back against a cabinet beside the door and slid down to sit. put her hands on her temples and tried to shove her head back to a normal size. The relative darkness steadied her. She stared at the floor, hoping what was happening to her was almost over. She looked up and the room shifted nauseously. It's not over. Charlie closed her eyes, took a deep breath at the stale air, and opened them again. Fur, claws, eyes. She clapped a hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. A jolt of adrenaline cut blissfully through the fuzziness. The room was full of creatures, but she couldn't make sense of them. The dark fur of a simian arm lay on the floor, inches from her feet, but out of it spilled coils and bare wire. The rest of the ape was nowhere to be seen. There was something large and gray in front of her, a torso with arms and webbed, ambitious hands, but there was no head, and instead something that had balance, a large cardboard box where the neck had been. Past the torso were standing figures, a phalanx of shadows. As she stared them down, she resolved into something comprehensible. They were unfinished mascots, as distorted as the ones outside. A rabbit stood at the back. Its head was brown like a jackrabbit, and its ears were swept back, but its eyes were just empty holes. The rabbit's body was hunched to the side, and its arms were short, held as if into surrender. Two metal frames stood in front of it. One was headless, and the other topped with the head of a red-eyed, slithering black dog, whose fangs stuck up from its mouth. Charlotte kept her eyes on it for a moment, but it didn't move. Beside it, Charlie cringed and ducked her head, covering her face with her arms. Nothing happened. Cautiously, she lowered her hands and looked again. It was Freddy. The misshapen Freddy had been buried. Charlie glanced at the door, then back at Freddy. He stared straight ahead, his eyes blank and his hat askew. It can't be him, she told herself. It's just another costume. But she shrank back, trying to make herself smaller. Something delicately stroked the top of her head. Charlie screamed and yanked herself away. She turned to see a disembodied human arm on the shelf above where she'd been sitting. Its hand stuck out just the right height to brush her head. Other arms were stuck beside it on top of it. Some covered in fur and others not. Some had fingers, some simply ended cut off of what had been the wrist. The other sleeves were stocked with similar things, one with pellets of fur, another with piles of detached feet. One had just dozens of extensions, cords tangled up in an ugly nest. From outside the door, Charlie heard the voice again. Hello? The doorknob rattled. She squeezed past the mutilated arcade games and chopped off parts, grinding her teeth as she crawled over soft things that squelched beneath her weight. As she stepped back, her shoulder crashed into one of the standing metal frames, the headless one, erect on its ungrounded feet, threatening to topple. She tried to pull away, but the frame followed, swaying for a moment as she fought to free her hands. She hit them back and ducked as more metal frames came crashing to the ground. She squatted down beside one of the large arcade cabinets. The plastic casing was cracked so badly the words and pictures were entirely obscured. Right beside her, inches away, were Freddy's stocky legs. Charlie huddled down, pressing against the game as if she could blend in with it. Don't turn around, she thought, eyeing the motionless bear. The dimming light seemed to be moving like a spotlight. It glinted off the dog's red eyes, then a gleaming tusk, then off something sharp corner at the back of the rabbit's hollow socket. Just out of her line of sight, something moved. Charlie whipped her head around, but there was Nothing there. From the corner of her eye, she saw the rabbit straining its spine. She turned frenziedly back toward it, but found it hushed in its same unagonized posture as before. Slowly, Charlie looked around her in a half circle, keeping her back pressed against the console. Hello? The doorknob rattled again. She closed her eyes and pressed her fist to her temples. No one's here, no one's here. Something rustled in front of her and Charlie's eyes snapped open. Scarcely breathing, she watched as Freddy came alive. A sickly twisting sound filled the room, and Freddy's torso began to turn. Hello? Her eyes shifted to the door for a split second, and then she looked back at Freddy, but still. I have to get out of here. She took a moment to measure the path, looking first to the door, then to Freddy in front of her, mapping a blurry route. At last she went, looking down at her hands and nothing else, as she crawled steadily around the motionless legs of the standing animatronics, and past the half-vessel games. Don't look up. Something brushed against her legs as she passed it, and she brushed on, her head down. Then something grabbed her ankle. Charlie screamed and flailed, tried to kick herself free, but the iron grip tightened. She looked frantically over her shoulder. Freddy was crouched behind her, the light glinting off his face and making him seem to smile. Charlie yanked her foot back with all her strength, and Freddy pulled even harder, dragging her closer. Charlie grabbed the leg of a pinball game and hoisted herself to her knees. As Freddy tried to drag her back, the game shook and ran like it was about to fall. Clutching at it all with all her might, Charlie jerked her body up and forward. Freddy's claws tore his skin as she wrenched herself free, and the pinball machine collapsed under her weight. Freddy lurched forward, that horrible mouth unhinged again like an enormous snake. He crashed again, coming toward her like an enormous, sinuous motion. She scrambled over the broken game toward the door. Behind her, something rustled and scraped, but she didn't look back, her hand on the doorknob. Charlie stopped as the room around her swayed. The noise behind her grew louder, closer, and she turned to see Freddy, crawling toward her like a predatory crouch. His mouth was widening. Dirt poured out of it in a steady stream. Hello, Charlie? Came a voice from outside, but this voice was different. It wasn't an animatronic child. Charlie fumbled at the knob, the spinning sensation in her head worsening as Freddy came slowly, purposely closer. The room swayed again, and her head closed in the knob and turned it. She shoved the door open and stumbled into the light. Charlie! Someone cried, but she didn't look up. The sun of brightness was piercing, and she held up a hand to shield her eyes as she forced the door shut again. The ringing had stopped while she was in the closet, but now it was louder. It filled her ears like a skewer, plunging into her swollen brain. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around her head, trying to protect it. Charlie, are you okay? Something touched her, and she shut away. Her eyes screwed shut against the light. Charlie, it's John, the voice said, cutting through the awful noise, and something in her went still. John, she whispered, her voice raspy. The dust from the grave had settled in her throat. Yeah. She turned her head and peered up through the shield of her arms. Slowly, the blazing light calmed, and she saw a human face. John, are you real? She asked. Uncertain what kind of answer would convince her. He touched her again, a hand on her arm, and she didn't pull away. She blinked, and her vision cleared a little. She looked up, feeling as she were opening herself to attack. Her eyes lit on two more open people, and her halted mind slowly named them. Jessica? Clay? Yeah, John said. She put her hand on his and tried to focus. She could see Jessica, who was doubled over. Her hands were over her own ears. The noise, Charlie said. She hears the noise too, do you? It grew louder, drowning out John's response, and Charlie gripped his hand. Real. This is real. The children, she cried out suddenly, as a swath of undaunting colors rose from underneath the tables. They flew, their feet not touching the ground, their bodies leaving common-like trails of color behind them. Do you see? Charlie whispered to John. Jessica, he shouted. Look out! Jessica strained, dropping her hands, and yelled something indistinct. The children, covering in on her in a swarm, dancing around her, darting in close, then back out again, as if it were a game or an ambush. Two rushed on Clay, who stared them down until they shriveled and swirled back to join the circle around Jessica. The lights! Jessica cried, her voice raising above the painful ringing noise. Clay, it's coming from the lights on the walls. She pointed up where Charlie could just make out a long row of decorative colored lights, evenly spaced. A gunshot cut through the clamor, and Charlie gripped John's hand tighter. Jessica's hands were on her ears again. The children were still in motion, but it was a nervous, shimmering movement. They stopped in place. Clay stood on his back to them, his clay pointed to the wall. Charlie watched, wide-eyed, as he took aim again and showed the bulb of the second light fixture. The room dimmed slightly, and he moved onto the third, then the next, then the next. As one shot rang out for another, Charlie's head began to equalize, like whatever stuff filled her to the point of bursting was slowly being drained. The room darkened. One bulb at a time. Bang! She looked up at John, and his face was clear. It's really you, she said, her voice still choked with dust. Bang! It's really me, he agreed. Bang! The children's shimmering slowed, giving glimpses of arms and legs and faces. Jessica took her hands from her ears. Bang! Clay shot the last light and the children stopped shimmering. They wavered briefly on the edge of solidity. A sickening ripple of lights scattered in harmony, and then they were still. The room was silent. It was still lit by the overhead lights, but all the others were dead. Jessica looked around, her bafflement and horror taking turns on her face. The children were no longer children. They were wind-up toys, plastic toys, in striped shirts, wearing plastic smiles and propeller beanies and offering balloons. Jessica, come here, Clay said in a low voice, holding out his hands. She stepped toward him, glancing wearily at the balloon boys as she moved between them. She took her hand to help her through, as if he were pulling her out of a chasm. Charlie slowly let go of John's hand and put hers on her temples, checking to make sure everything was still there. Her head no longer ached. Her vision was clear. Whatever had come over her was gone. Charlie, Jessica said, are you alright? What's going on? I feel drugged. These things are real. Charlie steadied herself and slowly got to her feet. I mean, they're real, but not how we're seeing them. This whole place is an illusion. It's twisted somehow. Those things. She gestured toward the wall where Jessica Clay had shot out the lights. Those things were like the disc we found. They emit some kind of signal that distorts how we see. Charlie shook her head. We have to get out of here, she said. There's something worse here than anything else. She pushed over a balloon boy and it toppled easily. Its head popped up as it hit the ground, and it rolled across the floor. Hello? And muttered much quieter than before.